Hello and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen. I'm an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa. And I present these videos every week for a couple different reasons. The first of which just to move my brain out of the mode of background work as I am moving towards the sermon over the course of the week, working with the gospel text, and move into the process of actually writing and preparing the sermon that I'm going to preach to my congregation for the weekend. It's the first reason I do these, and the second is just to allow you, the viewer, who have come across this video for whatever reason, to gain some different insight into the assigned gospel text for the week. So that is why I do this. This particular Sunday, which is October 23rd, 2016, the 23rd Sunday after Pentecost, the 23rd Sunday happening on the 23rd. That's kind of cool. Our gospel text comes from Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. This story, this parable, is known as the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Comes directly on the heels of the parable that we heard from last week, the parable of the persistent widow and the unrighteous judge. Apparently we're into a moment where we have comparisons in our parables, one type versus another type, it seems that way anyway. But we continue to be on the road towards Jerusalem. We're getting quite close now. As we are here into the middle of chapter 18, Jesus actually arrives into Jerusalem in chapter 19 of Luke's Gospel. So we're getting quite close to the culmination of all of this work, of all of the work that God is doing through Christ in the world. So that's kind of where we're at along with that. A similarity between this particular parable and the one from last week is that the brief narrative introduction to each one kind of sets up who it's this aimed at, or what is the point of this parable, which sometimes we get within the parables and sometimes we don't. It at times makes interpretation easier, and at times almost seems to make it more difficult because it puts us into a specific mindset, and maybe there's something else that's jumping out at us. And I think that's kind of, again, the case this week. It was similar to last week. If you're curious about that, flip back to last week's that was a weird noise. To last week's video. There's the word I'm looking for. Thank you. Okay, but all that being said, let's go ahead and jump in. Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of all of my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. Okay, so that's the parable, the story that Jesus shares. Now, important to recognize that as a parable, these aren't two specific people that Jesus is comparing, but they might as well be. This notion of the self-righteous Pharisee and the repentant tax collector applies to people that we know, people that Jesus would have known, people that his audience would have known. They would have known people like this. Now, a quick word about the Pharisee. All too often, the Pharisees get the bad rap within the Gospels. They're forever the opponents of Jesus because they're members of the religious elite who opposed him. And certainly there were Pharisees that opposed him, or members of that group that opposed him. But it's also important to remember that these were regular people. And yes, they were the religious elite, but they were, for lack of a better term, they were a denomination that followed the law extraordinarily closely and put great stock into it. Now, not to say that the Jewish people did not all attempt to follow the law, for they did, but the Pharisees were almost, you might say, fanatical about it. But there were also humble Pharisees, and we do hear at different times of encounters that Jesus has with Pharisees, where they are seeking to learn or they're seeking to understand. So So considering or thinking about the Pharisees always in terms of being the bad guy can be a mistake for us, and we need to remember that, especially in light of this parable. Keep in mind that this is aimed at people who self-justify or think that they are righteous. And that's interesting to consider. I read some things this week that are kind of resonating with me. This notion of righteousness versus justification. Now, these are two church words that we like to throw around, and what do they mean? Now, at times, we probably tend to consider them as kind of being the same thing, and there's definitely similarities. I know that I think of them oftentimes in the same way as well. But from what I read, righteousness, especially like self-righteous, if we want to apply that term, oftentimes applies to the idea that we are right in the eyes of God because of what we do, that we achieve righteousness, that righteousness comes through the law, through adhering to the rules, from doing things correctly. Whereas justification is recognizing that being right in the eyes of God comes from God, that we are justified by another, but the way we act is what makes us righteous. Well, I don't know about that. I don't know what I think about that. It's I can kind of look down that road and kind of think, man, okay, I understand the logic behind it, and I think I maybe can kind of nod yes, like I'm doing now, at the logic. I don't necessarily buy into it, but there is the notion that that if there's a critique here, it's that the Pharisee is, in this particular case, seems to be the example of what not to do. Although I don't think it's because of his self-righteousness. I think it's more so from the notion that he is comparing himself to others in his prayer, and he is the focal point within the prayer. God, I thank you that I am not like these people. So he's kind of taking these examples, including the tax collector, and throwing them under the bus, as if justification or faith or righteousness or whatever word you want to use is a ladder that we climb, and that he is farther up the ladder because of how he acts, and therefore he's better off than the people who are lower down the ladder. That seems to be the critique, and it's, I thank you that I am not like these people. Who's the focal point? He is. So self-righteousness or self-justification, maybe whichever term we want to use, is irrelevant, but the self being the focus is the problem. And if we flip over to the tax collector and we think about his situation, we hear Jesus says that he is justified because for him the action is not focused on himself. He recognizes that he's a sinner. God, have mercy on me. I'm very much reminded of the story of the two criminals hanging next to Jesus, one who mocks him and the other who says, we deserve what we're getting. Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus says, truly, I tell you, today you'll be with me in paradise, which is also in Luke's gospel. So that makes it very fitting to think that the focal point for that criminal is not is honesty of I deserve what I get, but Lord, you do the action. Remember me. You remember me when you come into your kingdom, which Jesus says, I will not only do that, I will do more. And same situation here. The tax collector recognizes his sinfulness, and brings it before God, although from a distance, knows that he's a man who is sinful and is not worthy to approach God. That's why we hear he stands far off. And the setting of this, again, remember parable, but the setting of it is important too, that it's in these two guys come up to the temple. Well, the temple was the center of worship. It was the center of the Jewish culture there in Jerusalem. The inner room, the Holy of Holies, as they call it, which is where the Ark of the Covenant had been stored. It wasn't at this point because the Ark had been lost by that point, but the inner room is where God lives, behind the curtain which will be torn in two at the death of Jesus, also in Luke's gospel. But that's where you came. That's where you came to worship. That's where you came to make your sacrifices of atonement. the sacrifice for your sin. That's where you came to basically be declared justified, to be declared righteous again. That's where you did it. So the Pharisee thinks I belong here because of what I do, and the tax collector won't even approach God. Now, wonderfully enough, in the death of Jesus, the ripping of the curtain reminds us that God is out in the world. God is not limited to one place. God is not found only in one place, but God is in the world, and is perhaps the notion is set loose through the death of Christ, made accessible. I don't know. Insert your own example there, but that's all coming. That's all, and we're coming right up in that within the narrative. But what's interesting to note about these guys, and the thing to also remember about the tax collector, yeah, he's sinful, and he recognizes it. What we don't know about the guy, and again, only a story, but what we don't know is, was there any change? Or does he come up every week and do the same thing? Is he come and say, Lord, I'm a sinner, forgive me, have mercy on me, but I'm going back to my life and I'm gonna act the same way. I'm still gonna be a tax collector tomorrow. I'm still gonna cheat people tomorrow. I'm still gonna live in the same way tomorrow, and I'll come back in a week and I'll pray the same prayer. Are either one of them better? I don't know. What we do know is that Jesus declares this man to be justified because he recognizes his sinfulness, and I think that's the takeaway. That's the direction I think I'm going to go with this sermon. I think, honestly, I don't exactly know, because there's a lot of stuff going on in my community right now that is very, very difficult to deal with, and if nothing else, is leaving me as a pastor feeling grossly broken and inadequate to do my job, to declare the gospel, to be used by God, to find hope, to find the good news within the gospel. And that's a bit of a personal reflection, personal disclosure that there's things going on, and I won't go into the details. I'm not going to do that, but I feel right now like the tax collector who doesn't even feel worthy to approach God. Have mercy on me, God. You have to do this because I can't. That's how I feel. That's how I think maybe a lot of people within the community are feeling, and so I may address that in the sermon as well. I don't know. It's one of those where we're just going to kind of have to see what happens, and sometimes that happens. But anyway, little side note there. If you have thoughts, questions, comments based on this text, by all means, share it down in the comment section, and you and I can continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, I hope you have a blessed week, that God is with you, and we will catch you next time.